At 5:30 a.m. on December 21st, 1944, in Bastogne, Belgium, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood in the cold basement command post and watched. German panzer tanks get ready for an attack that will decide how many of his men that were surrounded make it out alive. For the next 2 days, McAuliffe was in charge of all the Allied troops in Bastogne, the 101st Tank Destroyer Battalions, Artillery, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, and the Airborne Division battalions, scattered engineering units, and lone wolves from broken divisions. About 18,000 men, 46 years old, were circled by 3 German divisions from the Washington District of Columbia and graduated from West Point in November 1918. He was in charge of not the division commander, but the artillery chief. Major, the real boss, General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington, D.C. for meetings. By now, McAuliffe was in charge, as usual. That morning, the Germans had fully surrounded the town, cutting off all other routes, every single highway. It was 5-1 against McAuliffe's troops, and they were low on, there is ammunition, most guys don't have winter clothes, and the temperature is dropping to minus 15 degrees. C and the next Allied troops were 60 kilometers away, fighting through German lines. Ways to get to them: the German Panzer divisions, plus the 26th Panzer, 2nd Panzer, and Panzer. The ring was being closed by Volk Grenadier Division. Their job was to take over the Bastogne Road intersection and move west to Antwerp and the Meuse River. Hitler's last frantic attack on the west. Everything depended on how quickly they could take that crossroads before the Americans showed up with more help. But this is what the Germans did not get it. What they thought was a trap turned out to be their biggest military mistake ever. Not nice. By going around Bastogne instead of going around it, they would have to focus their armor on a killing zone that would cost them 5 divisions and any chance of getting what they wanted. The 2 days before, on December 12th, McAuliffe knew this. 19th, he told the leaders of his regiments exactly why getting trapped at Bastogne would mean the end of the German attack. And the next 8 days would show that McAuliffe was right. They would destroy Germany's last armored backup in the West, and what looked like a disaster turned out to be one of the most important American wins of World War II. The 106th Infantry Division was the first American unit to be killed by the German offensive, which happened in December 17th of 1944. While he was still going north, McAuliffe heard that they had fallen from France. The 106th had been in charge of the Chauny-Eifel, a hill on the German border. The new Green Division was put in the peaceful Ardennes area for seasoning. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the Germans hit them with 9,600 guns firing for 30 minutes. The tanks then came. 3 German 24 forces with more than 400,000 men smashed through an 80-kilometer front held by there are 4 tired American categories. The 106th got trapped, cut off, and wiped out. About 8,000 Americans gave up, which was the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in Europe during the war. The whole war. Some of those cops had worked with McAuliffe before in other jobs. He knew what they could do, and they were good sailor. On December 17th, 8th Corps officers kept an eye on. In their last radio messages, they begged for more ammo and air, backup for any kind of help, then static noise. According to the official, later said that the division fought well given the circumstances, that they held off the German attack, and that their giving up things saved time. McAuliffe knew some of that was true, but the real issue was that they were in the not the right place or battle to fight. They got spread out to defend a line. Piecemeal was crushed by a lot of German weapons. The second accident happened on December 17th at Clairvaux. The 28th, the 2nd Panzer Division, hit the infantry division that was in charge of the town. 16,000 men and tanks. For 2 days, the 28th fought building to building. 700 guys died. The town was destroyed on December 18th. The road to Bastogne was made clear. On December 19th, McAuliffe was at Camp Mormelon in France and saw 2 American divisions being wiped out. Had seen spy reports that showed the German breakthrough moving westward and not stopping. It was always said that you shouldn't let yourself get trapped. You can still move around freely. You keep your lines of support open. You stay away from places where the enemy can gather a lot of people to fight you. Being encircled meant being destroyed. That was known by everyone in the army. Still, on December 18 at 3 a.m., the 101st Airborne Division put their gear on trucks at Camp Mormelin and drove north toward Bastogne, where they were told to hold the town at a crossroads at all costs. Not enough ammunition, no cold gear, and no clear information on how strong the enemy is. Most of the division's top leaders were not there. Very important General Maxwell Taylor, the leader of the section, was in Washington, D.C. for staff meetings. General Gerald Higgins was a brigadier Briton. McAuliffe, who was 46 years old and had never been in charge of artillery before, took over as division artillery chief. Experience leading troops at the division level. McAuliffe got to Bastogne on December 19th at 9 a.m. and met with the 8th Corps leader, Major General Troy Middleton, was having his headquarters moved south as the Germans closed in. The meeting was short and rushed. Middleton's staff was on fire. Paperwork, loading cars, and getting ready to leave. The sound of guns firing was getting near. It was said that German armor was 10 kilometers away and moving quickly. Middleton told McAuliffe that things were really bad. 3 or 4 German units were coming together to attack Bastogne from different ways. There were American units all over the area. Some units were destroyed, others were forced to withdraw, and some were still holding but were on their own. The network of roads was breaking down. In a few hours, or maybe even a day, Bastogne would be surrounded on all sides. Middleton had already sent the troops he had to hold off the Germans. Colonel William Roberts was in charge of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. He had arrived the day before and been split into 3 groups to do different jobs. The Dubry team, led by Major William Dubry, was sent to stop the 2nd Panzer Division. They went north to the village of Noville. Cherry Team Cherry, Lieutenant Colonel, was sent east to slow down Panzer's lair in Longville. Lieutenant in charge of Team O'Hara, Colonel James O'Hara, was sent to the southeast to watch over a different method. These were not big armies. Each task force had there were 400 men, 12 tanks, and some tank defenders, but they were all Middleton. The armed teams of the 10th bought important time. In Noville, in December 19th and 20th, Team Desabré, with help from the 5,001st Parachute Regiment. For 36 hours, the infantry regiment held off the whole 2nd Panzer Division. The fighting was terrible. Tank fights up close in fog and snow. American tank M18, Hellcats from the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion, killed more than 30 German tanks. In the end, the Germans made the Americans leave, but the 2nd Panzer lost 2 full days and a lot of people because of the delay. When, after getting rid of Noville, the 101st Airborne set up defenses around Bastogne. Cherry Longville's team won, surrounded and mostly destroyed, but not before they caused more delays and damaged a number of German cars. In the battle at Warden from December 19th to December 22nd, O'Hara-led German advances were slowed even more by the fighting retreat. These acts by small groups, valiant defenses by the hours that McAuliffe needed to position, the 101st were bought by troops that were outnumbered. Middleton needed the 100 to keep Bastogne in check while other troops planned an attack. McAuliffe asked him how long he had to hold. He told me he didn't know. It could be 3 days, a week, or until they're all gone. Died. McAuliffe told them to wait. Next, Middleton said something that McAuliffe agreed with, would remember clearly many years later. Middleton told him, "Don't worry about being surrounded. If they surround you, that's okay. They'll be right where you want them," he told her. At the time, McAuliffe thought that was power optimism, that this is what police say to boost confidence. But after 3 hours of examining the land and studying the route network, McAuliffe saw that Middleton was right the whole time. Getting Bastogne wasn't a disaster when it was surrounded. There was a chance. December 19th, 1400 hours. McAuliffe got his regimental leaders together in Bastogne's basement. The 5,001st Parachute Infantry Regiment is led by Lieutenant Colonel Julian Yu. The 5,002nd is led by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chappie. Colonel Robert Sink is in charge of the 56th. Colonel Joseph Harper, who is in charge of the 327th Glider Infantry, and Colonel William Roberts from the 10th Armored, the leaders of the artillery and the staff officers. It was cold and busy in the room. One bare bulb lights the room. McAuliffe put the map out on the table. The barons sat at the point where 7 roads met. All of the roads in the Ardennes went through this town, from north to south, from east to west. Without Baston's roads, you couldn't move big groups of machines. Then McAuliffe looked at the map and told what was going to happen and why it would be good for the United States. We don't need these roads as much as other people do. Their whole attack is based on speed. They might have 4 days to get there, the Meuse River, before we can get enough people to stop them. 4 days to travel 80 kilometers through rough country in the winter. It's not possible across the country. With protection, the roads are needed. Right now, all the roads go through this area. Then McAuliffe said, the German Panzer divisions are rushing west to get around us. 2nd Panzer Division to the Panzer's lair is to the south. They want to leave us behind and deal with us later when the infantry forces arrive. But they can't because every ton of goods, every liter of fuel, and a truck carrying ammunition for their spearhead units has to go through this network of roads, and we're sitting on it. They are surrounding us, but they aren't catching us. Instead, they are sending forces to keep us where we are, when they should be moving quickly. West. Every tank they put around our border is a frosting. Every piece of artillery they put in place to attack us is gunfire that's not hitting the Meuse, helping them move forward, and they can't easily pull those troops back because we're behind them. Their lines are giving us trouble. More importantly, when they surround us, they will fix their troops around a known target, which will be our target, and attack it in the same way. Targets coming from the same direction over and over. We know where they're coming from because we have control of the town. They have to go down the roads to get to us because they are armed and need the roads. We can get ready for defense, set up our posts, artillery, and anti-tank weapons ahead of time so they are exactly where we need them. If they attack, they'll be coming from predictable areas and attacking into defenses that have been set up. Stretched behind them, going back through land where our troops can be a nuisance, they'll have to protect their flanks, protect their backs, and keep an eye on their supply lines. When replacements come through, we're already in the best spot, right behind them, cutting their lines. It was Lieutenant Colonel Uhl who asked, what happens if the reinforcements don't break through? McAuliffe said, then we'll all die, but the Germans won't get to the Meuse either because they gave up too soon. It takes too much time and strength to take this town. In any case, the assault fails. The question is whether we'll be alive to see it. Ended, and the officers went to set up their units. McAuliffe knew what was going on. It was a good plan in theory, but it still felt wrong in my heart. It looked like a disaster, but Middleton made a point that McAuliffe couldn't fight with. He had seen 2 movies in 2 days. American forces are destroyed when they fight the wrong way and are spread out trying to protect everything. They didn't defend anything, so the 106th was attacked because they couldn't focus there. Forces. The 28th was beaten because they tried to hold on to towns that weren't important from a military point of view. Bacon did matter. It was also better to defend one town with a small group of troops than a 100-kilometer line with units spread out. They couldn't help each other. It was noon on December 20th, and the Germans closed the ring. Bastogne was fully surrounded by 7 highways that cut through it. The perimeter wasn't round or neat, tracked the terrain, used towns as strongholds, and went about 26 kilometers of defense positions held by about 18,000 American soldiers, if you count the 100 armored vehicles that were attached to them. Colonel Roberts put together Team Snafu, which was made up of tank destroyer units, artillery, stragglers, and support men. McAuliffe knew what the Germans would do, which was to look for weak spots. This meant that the defense plan worked. Find one, get everyone together, and try to break through to the middle of town. The U.S. defense wasn't trying to hold every inch of ground. It was meant to take hits and redirect them, killing zones and destroy them with fire. Ground could be given up temporarily as long as the defense held. The artillery kept shooting, and the 5,001st Parachute kept moving in sync. An infantry unit led by Lieutenant Colonel Uhle held the eastern border from the train near Lucery to Marvy, which is in the southeast. Between the train and Foy, the 56th, led by Colonel Sink, held. Lieutenant Colonel Chapuis was in charge of the 5,002nd, which was in charge of the northwest area from Foy to Hemrel. From the 5,002 left, Colonel Harper's line was the longest and shortest. Side all the way around to the south, all the way to Marvy. Behind all of them, in the middle, 3 companies of 155mm howitzers led by Colonel Thomas. The artillery could shoot in any direction, and Sherburne had already signed up in masses on every possible way the Germans could attack. When commanders ordered to fire, the shells came quickly and hit the target exactly where they were needed. There are now 40 tanks from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. These are the last tanks of the teams that held off the Germans, gathered and moved to the middle of the battlefield so they could be ready for any breakthrough. At 1500, the first German probe arrived. Hours on December 20th, an army company from the 26th Volk Grenadier. The division was moving up the road from the south toward 327th lines. Glider infantry. The Americans let them get within 200 meters and then started firing. There were machine guns, rifles, and grenades in the attack, which ended in 8 minutes. The Germans won. They pulled back, leaving 32 bodies on the road. That was an American murder. They stopped a German attack, and 3 men were hurt, one severely. Company with 3 deaths because the Germans had to come up the road straight and set up their posts. Watched the radio activity from his command post and began to understand what Middleton meant. The second attack then happened. At 17:30 hours, it was heavy. There were 2 companies with tanks and 6 Mark V Panzers, moving forward on the 5001st section near Neff. They got to 150 meters before the Americans did. Guns from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, M18 Hellcats, started fire on tanks. Fire. 3 tanks were wrecked in 90 seconds. The other tanks backed off. The troops moved back. 5 Americans were hurt, and 1 Hellcat was damaged. About 80 Germans were killed, and 3 tanks were destroyed in the attack. Everything had stopped for good, and the Germans hadn't learned anything useful about American positions because they'd all given up. They would probably come back tomorrow in the same place and way. The people of the United States would be ready again by December 21st. The goal of Bastogne's defense wasn't to hold the line, it was to destroy German units as quickly as possible. Every failed attack cost the Germans men and tools they couldn't afford to lose. Every hour they spent in battle was money they couldn't afford to waste. The Germans were losing blood because their spearhead units weren't moving west for an hour while they were attacking Bastogne. They fought fixed defenses and didn't get anything done. The real trouble was supplies. Bastogne had been a supply point, base, but most of the supplies had already been moved south before the Germans reached the town. The 101st then arrived, with few weapons, almost no emergency supplies, and not much food. December 21st, ammo was limited. Artillery could only fire 10 rounds at a time. Each person could only have 1 gun a day, and automatic weapons could only fire short bursts. Not many shots were left, so each one had to count. The food was worse. About 2 days of rations had been brought by the division by December 21st. Men in Camsley.com were on half rations, and by December 22nd, they were on quarter rations. Temperatures were, it stayed below freezing, and men were tired, hungry, and cold. Most of them didn't have winter uniforms. They wore any clothing they could find in abandoned areas or on dead soldiers, from people who had left the town. There were almost no medical materials left. On December 19th, a German patrol took over the division's service area and caught the main medical company, south of Bastogne. Most of the doctors, most of the instruments, and all of the morphine was caught, and the division's aid posts were using what they had on hand before they left. Camp Mormelon. Not enough men who were hurt died from injuries that could have been treated because there were not enough medical tools to properly treat them on December 22nd at 1100 hours. 4 German officers with a white flag came up to the American lines near the 327th glider. They were in the infantry area and brought a message from General de Pansa Tupin Hinrich. Freiherr von Lutwitz was in charge of the 47th Panzer Corps, and the word told them to give up. It said that the American troops were surrounded, outnumbered, and unable to get supplies. The only way out was to give up in an honorable way. There was a way to keep everything from going to zero. The message gave 2 hours for an answer. To McAuliffe's command post. He read it, looked at his staff, and said one word. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Card, his operations officer, said, "Nuts." McAuliffe said, "I mean nuts." That's my answer. Tell them to hell is open. Someone asked them if they were sure, and McAuliffe replied, "Absolutely." The written answer was sent back to the German officers and leader. "Nuts," the American said. Officials from Germany asked what it meant. Colonel Harper, who brought them back to the German lines and told them to go to hell. They aren't letting up. Von Lübowitz wasn't amused. Koenig offered fair terms and were expecting a real answer. When they didn't get it, the Germans would have to take Bastogne by force. Even more resources had to be put into the siege. Von Lübowitz pulled the second. He pulled parts of Panzer's division back from the western advance and told them to help take Bastogne. He made the 26th Volk Grenadier Division stronger. By December 23rd, 3 whole German divisions were centered around Bastogne, which was exactly what McAuliffe wanted. Those that should have been running toward the Meuse were instead planning strikes that would not work outside of Bastogne. At 8 a.m. on December 23rd, the weather got better for the first time in a week. That day the sky was blue, and McAuliffe saw what every fighter in Bastogne had been seeing. Waiting for planes. American planes. C-47S. Dozens of them flying. Keeping low over the border, they dropped supplies in bundles by parachute. The bundles fell across the defensive line. Food, medicine, ammunition, plasma. The restocking operation was huge, and 241 C-47 planes took part. In the first drop, they brought about 144 tons of goods, cases for weapons, medical packages with red crosses on them, and food containers. Plasma packages float down on parachutes of different colors that show what's inside. Not everything made it inside. The edges and some bundles got into the German lines. German forces watched. American goods fall from the sky, and the people in Bastogne know that every bundle that lands means they can. Some German units tried to shoot down the supply plane to make the battle last longer. They were chased off by American jet escorts. The artillery got enough shells to get more than the daily limit of 10. 40 rounds per gun were restocked, and infantry troops got more ammunition. Each rifleman fires about 50 shots, and machine guns fire belt after belt. Medical stations got morphine and plasma, as well as surgical tools and bandages. It changed everything, both tactically and mentally. Men who had been saving every round. Suddenly they had weapons to fight with, and men who were hurt and could have died from shock got plasma. The troops left, from almost falling apart to being ready for battle again in just one afternoon. Then came the fighter. P-47 Thunderbolts on close support flights attacking German bombers. Places were set up around the outside. The Panzers that had been painted green and brown for summer activities stood out. It was easy to see the P-47s against the snow as they dove in groups, dropping bombs and shooting. 50 caliber machine guns and rockets were used to attack. McAuliffe watched from a lookout point as 6 tanks burned in 20 minutes. The Germans tried to pull back. They got their armor back, but it was hard to move because the roads through the forest were so small. More tanks were destroyed, and more German soldiers were caught in the open by strafing runs, and cars were on fire. Not because they'd given up, but because the strike stopped in the afternoon of December 23rd. They had given up, but they couldn't because flying during the day with American air control was dangerous. They would have to wait for they could attack at night when the planes couldn't see them. But night strikes are harder and need better troops. Since the defenders know you're coming, you can't surprise them as much when you have air backup. Completely different psychological dynamic. McAuliffe's men had been trapped and outnumbered for 4 days, wondering if anyone was coming to help. The planes showed that someone was coming. It showed that they weren't forgotten, and it showed the Germans that they no longer controlled the ground. Germany's morale went down because they had been striking well-prepared defenses for 4 days and were losing men and tools, but they were not making any progress. They could not even work during the day. December 25th, 0300 hours, Christmas morning, the Germans fired off their main. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division just launched an attack on the western edge. Parts of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division came from Germany to help. The strike came from, they were directed at the villages of Shams and Hemmel and tried to break through to the center of Bastogne. The 327th Glider Infantry at 3:30 in the morning. About 2 companies and maybe 4,000 soldiers were hit, men with the help of tanks. The attack caught everyone off guard at first, got through in the American line, and brought German tanks into the area. McAuliffe was woken up by when the American heard the sound of gunfire, He ran to his operations center and started planning the defense. The response carefully broke up the German charge. The holes in the defenses let many other tanks fire at the German tanks. American tank destroyers were positioned in the depths and attacked from the flanks. Artillery had already been registered on the move-in. Routes dropped concentrations, which split up the next group of troops. The Germans stopped moving forward 600 meters inside the line. Their tanks couldn't push, moving forward without infantry backup. The infantry couldn't move forward because of the artillery fire. At 8 o'clock, McAuliffe told nearby units to launch counterattacks. Fighting from room to room in Hemru, grenades going through windows and guns being fired close up in the streets by noon. The Germans were pulling back. All of their tanks that had broken through were destroyed or left behind. The troops moved back at their starting lines. About 300 American men were killed. About 1,500 people were killed, and 18 tanks were destroyed in the Christmas attack. Was the Germans' best chance to take Bastogne. They had thrown everything they had at one line. They tried to surprise and break through the barriers, but it didn't work. The stepped-up American defense, the planned gunfire, and the defense in depth all worked just as planned. The Germans charged into a kill zone and were wiped out as McAuliffe had planned. December 26th, 1650 hours. Lieutenant Charles Boggess is in charge of a tank. 14 tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, crashed through. They got in touch with the German lines south of Bastogne, near the village of Assinois. The 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the United States. McAuliffe rushed forward to meet the rescue column after hearing on the radio that the siege was over. The road opened and supplies poured in. The wounded were taken away, and the Germans pulled back from the local perimeter, but didn't give up the siege. They were still in place around Bastogne and had full power over the it was no longer possible to encircle them. But the fight wasn't over yet. There would be more fighting for 3 weeks, but the Germans didn't know that they had already lost. Not just the fight for Bastogne, but the whole offensive. By putting all of their forces against Bastogne, it took them 8 days to mess up their own schedule. The spearhead sections never. They ran out of gas, time, and speed. These people reached the idea. From a different point of view shows how completely their advance was broken by the Battle of Bastogne. The 47th Panzer Corps, which von Leutwitz led, was in charge of taking Bastogne. Commander with 59 years of experience, who has been in 4 years of war on various fronts and knows how to run armored operations. 3 sections made up his army. 2nd Panzer, led by Colonel Minrad von Colonel Fritz Berlin, was in charge of Lau. Panzer's Den. Grenadier units led by General Major Heinz Kakot. These were elite troops that were well equipped by German standards at the time. War. On December 17th, von Leutwitz was sure. The first breakthrough had been made. It worked better than expected, and the American 8th Corps was broken. It was the 28th Infantry Division that gave up, not the 106th Infantry Division. It looked like the roads to the west were all over the place. American troops were falling back in chaos. Intelligence said that American stores were spread out, so it would take days to open. To pay attention. It looked like there was a clear path to the Meuse. The orders for Bastogne were easy. Surprise it, attack if you can, and get around it if you can't. Get stuck if you have to, but don't get stuck. The main goal was the Meuse River at Dong, which was 80 kilometers west. Speed was everything. The whole plan relied on German armored spearheads getting to the Meuse before the American reserves could. Anything that took too long meant loss. On December 18th, von Leutwitz's divisions arrived. Were moving forward well. 2nd Panzer was pushing north of Bastogne and had broken through American lines at Neuville. Panzer's lair was coming from the east. The villages had been cleared and the southern road was blocked. The Grenadier Division was following behind and keeping the road safe. Everything was going according to plan. Bastogne looked weak, protected by whatever American units were in the town at the time. Von Leutwitz thought about sending 1 regiment to take over Bastogne while his main army moved west. On December 19th, German information said that American air forces were in Bastogne. Interceptions, comments from prisoners, and reconnaissance reports all showed that the 101st Airborne Division was American. A group of special soldiers called the division had moved into town overnight and was setting up defenses. Everything changed. Airborne units weren't just a bunch of troops spread out in the rear area. They were special infantry, well-trained, experienced, and heavily armed. It would no longer be easy to take Bastogne. There would be a fight. Von Lüttwitz made the choice that crushed the offensive. He chose to. During his main push west, he would surround Bastogne and hold off the American troops. He would then take care of the town. But going around it would have meant leaving a strong American force behind. He put troops on the siege because they were blocking his lines and supply routes. These were troops that should have been on the defense. By December 21st, von Lüttwitz knew that control wasn't working. The Americans in Bastogne were sending out troops and ambushing supply convoys. Convoys and bringing in artillery to hit German positions. But they weren't stopped. Were busy and dangerous, and higher-ups wanted results. The attack was running behind schedule. The advanced units were running out of fuel because supply trucks were having trouble getting through. Von Lüttwitz had to take action. Bastogne to protect his transport routes. On December 22nd, von Lüttwitz sent he thought the Americans would be smart and give up when they saw they were trapped and outnumbered. Honorable terms. The American reaction drove him crazy, confused him, and then enraged him. It meant sending large groups of troops to attack Bastogne and kill him, which he needed for other tasks. December 23rd, when the weather got better, von Lüttwitz saw American planes drop supplies on Bastogne and fighter bombers hit. His places. The summer paint on his tanks made them stand out in the snow. From above, you could see where the groups were putting together. His supply lines were being cut off, and he couldn't do anything about it because Germany's air force was almost completely destroyed and had no way to fight off American air power. Von Lüttwitz lost his best assault division in the charges on December 25th. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was crushed to death. By December 26th, when General George Patton's 3rd, when an army came through from the south, von Lüttwitz knew that Bastogne was lost and that the whole assault had failed. His army failed. They fought for 9 days over one town instead of moving west as planned. It was over. The Meuse was out of reach. And now the Americans had control of Bastogne, cut off his supply lines in the back, putting everything behind him in danger. General de Panzer-Truppen Hasso von Manteuffel was in charge of the 5th Panzer Army, which was the offensive's main strike force. His plan called for him to get to the Meuse by December 19th. By December 21st, they were still 40 kilometers short of their goal and were stuck around Bastogne. Because Bastogne ran the roads, supply lines were totally cut off. Von Manteuffel tried to get around this problem. Bastogne sends Panzer for a second time, and Panzerlehr west around the town. The Panzer Division, led by Colonel Minrad von Lau, was meant to be the front line, the group that would get to the Meuse first and set up bridgeheads for the next groups. Von Lauert was in the commander had been on the Eastern Front before and was sure of his unit's skills. On December 19th, his unit was attacked. With more than 100 working tanks, the division sped west and broke through American lines north of Bastogne. The 2nd Oedo Panzer made great success for 3 days. By went around American strongpoints, stayed out of big battles, and focused on speed, December 22nd, they had gone almost 60 kilometers and were getting close to the town of Dino on the Meuse River. Von Lauo could see the valley of the river from his staff car. It took him only 5 kilometers to reach the tactical goal that Hitler had set for him. Then everything stopped. American forces were meant to have fuel trucks following behind on the roads through Bastogne, but they never showed up. Bastogne were blocking the supply lines by ambushing convoys and putting artillery on road intersections. The fuel that should have kept 2nd Panzer going was on fire in trucks 50 kilometers behind the front lines in December. 23rd, von Lau's tanks and trucks started to run out of gas, took fuel from other cars to keep some tanks moving, while others just stood there and waited for supplies never came, and the division's average daily progress slowed to a halt. They were stuck, standing still west of Bastogne, and could be seen by American spy planes being attacked by fighter jets at the moment. The weather got better. On December 24th, von Lau heard that they were moving armored troops, the 2nd Armored Division, and parts of the 84th Infantry Division to encircle his position. He asked for permission to leave, but the higher authority said no. Hold position. To keep the attack going, they had to wait for reinforcements that never came, because Bastogne was in charge of the roads. On December 26th, the 2nd Panzer, When the division's spearhead got stuck near the village of Scheles without fuel, American troops circled and destroyed it. Big Ernst von Kochenhausen was in charge of the 2nd Panzer fighting group at Chell. He tried to get away, couldn't hold on and wait for comfort, but it never came. On December 20th. On the 7th, Kochenhausen gave up his tanks and led about 600 men on. They walked through American lines on foot and left behind almost all of the division's leftover armor, including 100 tanks and assault vehicles. Panzer tanks, guns, and half-tracks were all left behind and captured by American troops. Tried to save the 2nd Panzer and attacked Scheles twice, but both were stopped. American fighter bombers and ground forces stopped them. After the 2nd failed effort to save him, Panzer Lehr stepped back. Before December, the division had gone on the attack with more than 15,000 soldiers and about 90 tanks. 28th, there were only 8,000 men left and less than 20 tanks that could be used. Killed in battle, the 26th Volk Grenadier Division, which had spent 9 days fighting Bastogne, was worn out and low on supplies. The division went into the fight with 17,000 men. By December 28th, their real strength was 7,000 deaths from attacks on fixed positions, airstrikes, and other causes because of the artillery. The division could no longer go on the attack and could barely hold its positions. For German commanders, Bastogne was a complete failure of operational planning. They thought American troops would be there. When hit by a sudden attack, they would spread out and run away. The Americans gathered at Bastogne and held. The Germans thought they could win. Avoid strong points and deal with them later. Instead, Bastogne was in charge of the Germans couldn't get around the important geography or the road network. It was thought that bad weather would keep American air power from flying forever. But on December 1st, the weather cleared up. 23rd, and American air power made it impossible for the Germans to move around. Importantly, the German leaders didn't understand until it was too late that they had set a trap by surrounding Bastogne. They were besieging an American force that was stuck. In reality, they had grouped their mobile units around a fixed position. America had ready-made defenses and air power that they could use to destroy them carefully. Every day spent every day that the attack slipped further behind schedule at Bastogne, and once the Americans broke the siege on December 26th, Bastogne turned into a sword that was aimed at the whole German back area. The Battle of Bastogne was pretty much over by January 1st, 1945. The battle went on for weeks and the Germans moved back from direct contact and set up defensive positions. From afar, tried to hold on to what little they'd gained. They'd lost the ability to move around strategically, and their Panzer divisions were only shadows of their previous selves. The offensive had failed. It was shocking how many Germans were killed around Bastogne. The 2nd Panzer Division came into the fight with 120 tanks and 16,000 men. By January 5th, 1945, the division said it had 28 operating tanks and less than 8,000 effectives. Losses: 92 tanks and 8,000 soldiers. Panzer came into the fight with 57 tanks and 15,000 men. By January 5th, the division had 17 tanks that were ready to go. 7,000 hits, 40 tanks lost, and 8,000 deaths. The 26th Volksgrenadier. About 10,000 of the division's 17,000 men died near Bastogne. The Grenadier Division, which was sent on December 25th, lost 60% of its strength in one battle. Weak. Other groups that were rotated through the fighting in Bastogne also lost soldiers. The German Army Group B After Action report gave an estimate of how many Germans died. Around Bastogne, at more than 20,000 dead, wounded, and missing, plus more than 200 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or left behind, which was bad for the German forces in the West. It was impossible to replace. Germany was saving up its last troops for the Ardennes assault. At Bastogne and other places in the battle, those stocks were wiped out, leaving nothing behind. Some of the divisions that were lost at Bastogne could have helped protect the Rhine River and slowed down the Allies' advance. But instead they were gone, smashed against American lines it was a failed offensive that didn't accomplish anything strategically, and the Americans who held Bastogne also paid a high price. It was possible for them to lose, but it was smart for them to win. Deaths in the Airborne Division from December 19, 1944 to January 6, 1945. The 10th Armored Division lost 341 soldiers, hurt 1,691, and went missing 516. About 500 men were killed by the division's Combat Command B. About 2,500 people were killed at Bastogne, but unlike the Germans, American equipment losses could be replaced, and reinforcements were on hand. B made up for by the huge American supply system, and the Americans had won. They had taken over Bastogne and destroyed it. They took out German divisions and stopped their last assault in the West. The story of Nuts became popular because of Anthony McAuliffe's one-word answer to the German demand that they give up. His deeds became legendary and were written about in newspapers all over the world. He became a symbol of American determination. As for Bastogne, General Patton gave him the Distinguished Service Cross on December 30th, 1944. The note hailed his awesome bravery, his inspiring leadership, and he was constantly under enemy fire while leading his men. He was he was made a Major General on January 3rd, 1945, and put in charge of the 103rd Infantry. It was his first time leading troops at the division level. He was in charge of the 103rd in Europe in the last few months of the war, crossing the Rhine River and moving through southern Germany. His section took over Innsbruck, Austria, and made it to the Brenner Pass. He stayed in the army after the war and held many important posts. He served his country as head of the Army's staff and chief of the Chemical Corps. In 1953, he was chosen to lead He led the 7th Army in Europe for 2 years before becoming Commander-in-Chief of the United. It was one of the most important jobs in the American military during the Cold War. He was in charge of the United States Army Europe. In 1955, he was made a 4-star general. He left the Army in 1956, after he then worked as a manager for American Cyanamid for 38 years. From 1959 to 1963, and was also head of the New York State Civil Defense Commission. From 1960 to 1963, he used his military skills in planning defenses for civilian emergencies being ready. When asked about Bastogne later on, he always said the same thing. The 1,001st didn't need help because they already had the Germans where they wanted them. He knew that the siege went exactly as planned. The ground around Bastogne was the Germans' deadly mistake, not an American one. McAuliffe died of leukemia on August 10, 1975, when he was 77 years old, buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. His wife, his son, and daughter are buried with him. Lieutenant General George Patton, who broke through to help, is also buried nearby. Bastogne thought it was one of the best operations of his career. It wasn't because 3rd Army freed troops that were trapped, but the 101 at Bastogne had set up several German divisions so that the 3rd Army could fight them from there. Bastogne's release wasn't a rescue. It was the second part of a planned operation that took away Germany's power to attack in the West. In 1945, German General Hasso von Manteuffel, who led the 5th Panzer Army, was taken and questioned in great detail. About the Ardennes attack, he said that Bastogne was where it failed because of the delay it caused. The timetable was thrown off by the concentration of German troops around Bastogne by the American resistance. The loss of Bastogne made it easier for American weapons and air power to hit. The Panzer divisions at Bastogne stopped the attack from moving around, which was what Manteuffel came to the conclusion of. There was a deadly mistake in strategy when they surrounded Bastogne instead of going around it. Who was in charge of the 5,001st Parachute Infantry Regiment at Bastogne and fought in the fight and kept serving? On December 18, his regiment was the first to attack the enemy east of Bastogne. 19. Had been an important post during the siege. Uhl went on to having a successful job that led to him becoming lieutenant general, served in Korea and Vietnam, and retired in 1973. When asked about Bastogne, he stressed how important it was for junior leaders and soldiers to stay in their posts even when things were impossible. For decades, American military strategy was changed by what Bastogne taught us. The idea that defensive places on important terrain can trap enemy forces and make chances for counterattacking became an important part of plans for defense during the Cold War. Every military school looked at Bastogne as an example of how to use artillery, air power, troops, and defenses. School in the world. In 1948, the Belgian government gave the city of Bastogne. In order to protect the town, the CUA DRA was given to the American 101st Airborne Division, Citation, which is the military's top award for a company. The 10th Armored. The Presidential Unit Citation was also given to Division's Combat Command B. A few streets in Bastogne were given new names that are based on American units. The defense with statues. Every December, Bastogne holds there were ceremonies to remember the fight, and military historians have figured out how many German divisions were actually defeated. The defense of Bastogne destroyed or made fighting useless. Most of the time, 5 groups are given: the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, the 26th Folk Grenadier Division, and parts of the 9th Panzer Division. Not all of them were killed, but all of them took enough damage to be useless for the rest of the war's offensive actions. Together, these divisions at the start of the assault, it had about 50,000 soldiers and 350 tanks. By the middle of January 1945, there were only about 100 working tanks left out of about 20,000 effectives. The fight of Bastogne had an effect on strategy that went beyond the immediate battle. For example, the destruction of German armored reserves in the Ardennes meant that there were fewer troops to protect against the Allies' advance into Germany. In March 1945, had less trouble because the Panzer troops that could have protected the river were no longer there, destroyed at Bastogne and other places during the Battle of the Bulge. The last Allied push to the Elbe River and the link getting to the Soviet troops faster, because the failed Ardennes offensive used up all of Germany's mobile reserves. McAuliffe's choice to hold Bastogne and his knowledge of why being surrounded was a good strategy, instead of being disastrous, shows a basic concept of warfare. The side that controls important terrain and makes the enemy attack well-prepared defenses has a huge edge. No matter how mobile, well-armored, or skilled the Germans were, it didn't matter when they had to fight. The ready positions at Bastogne. The Americans chose the ground and got ready, the walls, and stopped every single German attack. That's what Bastogne really taught us. The American forces didn't let the Germans trap them. Instead, they asked the Germans to gather their troops around a town that the Americans built forts and then destroyed those forces with weapons, air power, and foot soldiers. Fighting from ready positions. The Germans thought they were besieging Bastogne, but Bastogne was actually besieging them. They were put in a place where American weapons could destroy them, but the plan worked backwards. And by the time, as soon as the Germans knew it, they had lost 5 divisions and any chance of reaching their goal. We hope you found this story as interesting as we did. If you did, please like this movie. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Sign up to stay in touch with these hidden stories from the Second World War. Each one is important. Everyone should remember them. Also, let us know where you're watching by leaving a comment below. From Texas to Tasmania, our group has people from all walks of life. You're a part of something special here, fans. Thanks for watching and for keeping these stories alive.